Good morning, good afternoon, and maybe good evening if you're joining this call from outside the boundaries of Africa. Welcome to this edition of the launch where we are launching 3 papers speaking about the African demands for COP29. So essentially, these are papers that are presenting the key priorities that Africans are asking for as we gear towards COP29 and asking for that which is very vital for the peoples of Africa. Maybe just set the context is to let ourselves know that for the year 2024 has been said to be one of the hottest in record. By science has shown this. And of course, as we know that as the heats increase on the continent, it continues to affect the people's lives on the continent. And as a result, we are continuing to be impacted. So the year 2024 has seen floods in many parts of the continent. There have been heat waves, for example, in the Sudan, where people have died. Droughts have continued to ravage the Southern African region. And of course, this has had damaging impacts, especially on the economies, and of course, also people's lives. So health has been impacted and all that. So for this year's COP, it remains to be a very, very important session where Africa will be asking for key demands to ensure that it is able as a continent to deal with some of these ravaging effects of climate change. Even as we gather here, I think it's important to reiterate the fact that even though we bear the disproportionate impacts of climate change, we also know that the continent has contributed minimally to the causes of these changes that we are living today. So as we gather here as Africans and also maybe people from beyond Africa, what we are calling for is that people take responsibility for their actions, especially at the COP, and to ensure that justice is rendered, especially to those that have played a minimal role in terms of contributing to the impacts of climate change. So in this launch, we'll be speaking about 3 different thematic areas. One, we'll be looking at the question of finance, and we know that finance is the cog in the engine of climate action. But without finance and technology, we cannot be able to do anything with that. We can sing all along about climate action, but without the finance that's required to ensure that real activities happen on the continent, then it will just be nothing but just mere rhetoric. So for the COP, we are saying that we need to go beyond mere rhetoric and transform words to actions. And how this can be transformed, of course, is provision of the finances that is required to carry out climate action on the continent. So our colleague, Saada Mohammed, will be taking us through the finance paper that has been prepared. And then, of course, also we'll be looking at the question of adaptation. And again, we all know that for many of the people in Africa, this is the key priority for the continent, that adaptation remains to be the lifeline of the people of Africa. And as such, even as people go to negotiate at the COP, this message must be reiterated to all the negotiators, that for Africa, adaptation remains to be the only thing that saves their lives. And as such, it must be given the priority and the preeminence it requires in all the negotiations as they progress. At the same time, we also appreciate the fact of energy. So the third subject will be on energy. And we know, for example, that almost 600 million people in Africa still lack access to clean energy. And at the same time, if you look in terms of cooking, they say that close to 1 billion people on the continent of Africa still use unclean energy for cooking. And as a result, they are exposed to many maladies that come as a result of this. So the question is, how can the COP be able to be an instrument that will be able to provide the much needed clean energy access that will first be able to ensure that we reduce on emissions that are catalyzing the impacts of climate change that you're seeing today. So how do we transform from the use of, for example, dirty energy to clean energy that will be able to ensure that our planet, the only home we know as at now, remains sustainable and able to uphold the lives as we know them today. On the panel, at least, so we'll have Saada Mohammed. Of course, we'll have Ndivile Mokoena from Southern Africa, speaking on adaptation. Of course, she'll be supported by Patience Ajikum from Ghana, representing Strategic Youth Network Ghana. And of course, for the energy presentation, it will be presented to us by Emmanuel Umpula. So I welcome you all to please pay attention and of course follow the discussions as they progress, but at the same time to also prepare your very good questions, because after the presentations we'll open up to the plenary so that you can be able to ask all sorts of clarifications and questions you might have about the subjects we'll be talking about. You are much welcome now, and I think we can begin. To kick us off, I'm not sure if we have the other people on board. I know that we had invited the AGN chair. On my screen, I cannot see everyone, so please, if you are aware that the AGN chair is around, maybe you can just begin with him to ask him to present some sort of an opening remark. I seem not to see him on the call.
Juma, we're trying to get him on, but I think we can circle back to him. In the meantime, let's proceed.
All right. Thanks, Pumla. Thanks, Pumla, for that update. So in the meantime, as we wait maybe for the agent chat to see if he can join, and of course I understand that probably is in Baku, so engaged with other commitments. I'd like to just welcome Saada Mohammed Salah. If you can be able maybe to start by giving us your reflections on what really is at stake from a finance perspective for this COP and how we can be able to navigate it as Africa. Over to you, Saada.
Thank you, Juma. I hope I'm audible for everybody.
Yes, you are.
So allow me. So I hope, is my slides clear? Are my slides clear, or are they showing?
Yes, they are. Yes, they are.
All right. Thank you. Colleagues, welcome to this presentation. Basically, I'm going to take us through the African demands for COP29, and this presentation focuses on the finance. Sorry. Just a minute. I don't know why it's not moving. Okay, I think it's fine. Yeah, I think it's okay. Sorry about that. So this position paper focuses on climate finance for COP29 in terms of priorities for Africa. And the main aim is basically to guide and inform Africa's engagement at this crucial COP, which is themed as Climate Finance COP. And the paper highlights the key priority areas and demands, particularly with regards to the architecture of the new finance goal that we expect to be adopted at this COP. And it has to work for Africa's aspirations. So that is what actually inspired this paper. And also to mention that this paper is strongly aligned with the AGN positions with regards to this goal, as well as reflecting the different views and demands of the African CSOs at large. So just to give you a highlight of what the paper is looking at, we have a brief section on context for COP29. We've also covered a bit on shortcomings and the lessons from the 100 billion goal to give us context on what we expect within this goal, within the new finance goal, and also now a deep dive into the NCQG as a key priority for Africa at COP29. So basically, that's what the paper highlights. So I'll just briefly highlight on some of those sections. So just to give us some context, as we may all understand, COP29 is happening at the backdrop of the first global stocktake that happened, that was concluded at COP28. And the findings that actually showed that the world is not collectively on track in terms of achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. And it also shows us that the agreement, because it is as a universal document, was not able to inspire the needed climate action 10 years since its adoption. So basically, we are nearly failing as a continent, as a globe, sorry. And it also highlights that the current indices that we have are going to take us to a path towards 2.4 to 2.6 degrees Celsius. That is beyond the 1.5 temperature goal that we aim to achieve. So, and most of this little progress in this climate action is mainly attributed to the failed delivery of the 100 billion goal, which I will delve into later, by developed countries, with also lack of political frameworks and incentives that enable us finance some of this climate action. The COP is also happening at the backdrop of reducing trust in the multilateral cooperation. As we all know that these shortcomings of the 100 billion goal has basically lead to reduced trust and also lack of accountability. And it has been a contentious issue within the negotiations over the years. So looking forward, the GST decision called for formulation and implementation of ambitious and economy-wide NDCs and NAPs, which are aligned with the 1.5 temperature goal. But the question remains is, where is this support coming from for us to implement this ambitious goal? So that's the context. So here, sorry. So now going into the key issue of this COP, for us to understand the structure of, I don't know why it's misbehaving, apologies for that. I hope it's okay now. I think for us to first understand the structure of an NCQG that is fit for purpose for Africa. Did I skip a slide? I think it has. Hello? But the call has hung. I don't know what's happening.
Yes, Sada, we can, or I can hear you from where I am. So I think everything should be okay.
All right, sorry. So for us to understand why the NCQG is important for Africa, first of all, to understand what this goal is about. NCQG is the new collective quantified finance goal, which is supposed to replace the 100 billion goal that was committed back in 2009, where developed countries committed to provide 100 billion finance to finance climate action in developing countries. And for us to talk about this goal, it's supposed to take effects from 2025 as the 100 billion goal comes to an end. And it must take as a flow of USD 100 billion as the baseline, and it needs to consider the needs and priorities of developing countries. The NCQG also needs to demonstrate the continuation of the existing historical commitments from developing countries, because it's a continuation of the 100 billion goal. And it also has to signal the needed, the scale and the urgency of the response that is needed in this critical decade. And it also has to build on several lessons that we've learned from the 100 billion goal and the failed climate action within this decade. And it's also important for this goal to also restore the trust and confidence in this multilateral cooperation and also international commitment with regards to climate change response. So the working around this NCQG has actually started for over 2 years. It was initiated at COP26, and we've been having 2 years of deliberation, both political and technical, to discuss the different key elements of this new goal. But 2 years down the line, we've noted very slow progress on both technical and these political fronts, with very divergent views on various critical elements of this goal. And with the recent meeting in Baku that we have now what we call a draft text framework, which will now guide parties to engage at COP29. But I said it has very extreme divergent views, and therefore it requires a lot of political interventions, and compromises need to be made for us to actually get an outcome that we want COP29. So that's just to give you what the NCQG is about and why it's important for Africa. So I think first it's important for us to understand what structure of NCQG is fit for purpose for Africa. And for us to understand that, we need to be clear from onset that the new goal, what the new goal aims to achieve. And in this context, the NCQG is supposed to mobilize and deliver climate finance that will support effective and full implementation of Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, of course, in accordance with Article 9. And it has to support these ambitions that are actually expressed in the country-driven strategies, such as the NDCs and the NAPs. And this is mainly to implement the GST outcomes that we've had from the COP 2018. So this, in terms of the key structures, we also need to be very clear in terms of the context of setting this the new collective quantified goal. For Africa, we have demanding that the context of setting this goal has to be underpinned by the foundational principles of the convention as well as the Paris Agreement, particularly issues around equity, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, as also in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication. This context is very important for this goal to serve the purpose it's supposed to serve. And therefore, as Africa, we call for reaffirming of these principles without necessarily trying to change the provisions of the convention as well as the Paris Agreement. So that context has to be set clear. Then continuation of that, the other key elements, I don't know why it's jumping. Sorry about that. The other key element of the goal is one, the goal has to be based on the responsive, it has to be responsive to the evolving needs of developing countries. And this is crucial because we understand that our needs are going to evolve, and even as the temperature is also changing and science is as well as changing. And therefore, it's important for this goal to also cater for these evolving needs of developing countries. Current reports in various by various organizations actually put these needs into trillions annually. And this clearly shows you that the 100 billion goal that we had was very much understated, and therefore we need to call for trillions in terms of a quantum for this goal. But it's also important to note that most of these needs that are costed here, as much as they're in trillions, you'll find they are mostly based on NDCs of developing countries, which largely cover mitigation and adaptation, and they mostly exclude loss and damage. And therefore, we might not really say they are full representation of the true level of needs. And it's also important to understand that some of these indices also don't have all, most of these needs, some of them are also not costed appropriately due to limitations in methodologies. And I particularly refer this to adaptation and loss and damage for most NDCs in the developing countries. Therefore, as we set this NCQG, then it has to the quantum has to take into account these uncosted needs and also ensure that recognize the evolving nature of these needs over time. So this is the key element of this goal, and it's been very contentious so far. The first one is the structure of the quantum. For Africa, we are calling for an overall quantum over at least between 1 to 1.5 trillion annually by 2030. And of course, that aligns well with what you've seen in terms of the needs that have been established by most reports. And for us to also looking around, even within the other negotiation blocks within the developing countries, they are also demanding for at least 1 trillion. And that shows you the need is across, and everybody is sort of aligned in terms of this quantum. And then, as much as we understand that this new goal is going to be a mobilization goal in reference to Article 9.3 of the Paris Agreement, we cannot fail to emphasize the crucial role of the public finance as the core component of this goal. And this is really important. It has to flow from developed to developing countries in form of grants. And it's also important that this actually acknowledges the increasing sovereign challenges facing many developing countries at the moment. And it's also very important for it to catalyze mobilization of climate finance from other different sources. So we are calling for a public finance sub-goal within the overall quantum as one of the demands for Africa in terms of the structure of the quantum. Again, in terms of structure, we're also looking at, for Africa, we are demanding for a thematic sub-goal, which should actually have an annual provision of public finance of at least 400 billion each for adaptation, for mitigation, and for loss and damage. And this has to be expressed in grant equivalent terms. And these are basically learning from the imbalances that we've seen under the 100 billion goal. So this actually is to ensure that there is balanced and meaningful allocation across these thematic areas, and also help us to close the current finance gap, and for us towards implementing the GST findings. Of course, for Africa, adaptation remains a key priority, and we can't overemphasize the need for scaled up high quality finance. And I will leave this for the next presenter to delve much into it, because we have a priority paper on that, a position paper on that, sorry. And of course, another key element is loss and damage in the new collective quantified goal. This remains a key priority for Africa, and we demand the COP29 to actually recognize this as one of the third critical pillar of climate action, and this will give us sort of a basis to include a thematic sub-goal under the new collective quantified goal. We've seen a lot of traction around loss and damage since COP28. And for Africa, we also call for, actualization of some of those pledges that were made at COP28 and actually increasing more, because as you've seen, the needs are more than what was pledged. And therefore, we call for COP29 to fast track some of this progress. And also, as the NCQG outcome, it must facilitate how more finances can be mobilized from innovative sources for loss and damage fund. So that's on the structure. Another key element that is very crucial is the qualitative elements of the new goal. It's very essential for us to achieve the transformational outcome that we need and the progressive climate change impacts in the long run. And why is this important is because we've seen low quality finance under the 100 billion goal, and this needs to be addressed. And for us to understand what quality implies or breaking down, first the goal has to operationalize the additionality aspects. Climate finance has to be new and additional to the existing development assistance. It should not be repurposing or repackaging the ODA as climate finance, because this has actually been seen to create competition between climate and objective and development goals. So that needs to be addressed under this new goal. And then this goal has to also prioritize provision of debt-free climate finance in form of grants and highly concessional instruments. This is very important for Africa, considering we are actually experiencing a lot of debt crisis, and we cannot solve a climate crisis with a debt crisis. So this goal has to address this particular issue. We can't have over 80% of climate finance being delivered as loans. And this is particularly important for adaptation as well as loss and damage. Another key element under quality is to ensure that this goal actually incentivizes the reforms of the global financial architecture that is currently ongoing, but not really in a structured manner. So we will demand that this new goal, as an outcome of NCQG, there needs to be some traction in this area for us to also sort of raise overall resources for both climate and development objectives. Another quality element is in terms of access. We've seen under the 100 billion goal, there has been a lot of access barriers that has been experienced by most developing countries, and there's no point of having an ambitious climate finance goal if it cannot be accessed. So what is important is at least a large portion of finance under the new goal has to be channeled through the existing financial mechanisms, and this actually calls for enhanced complementarity and also coherence of these financial mechanisms to make it easy for developing countries to access finance under the new collective quantified goal. Another key element is about transparency and accountability frameworks, which is also another key lesson that we've learned under the 100 billion goal. It's important for Africa, at least we support the use of existing transparency and reporting frameworks within the Paris Agreement for us to track the implementation as well as the performance of this new goal. What happened in the past is we've had lack of clear and commonly, yeah.
Yes, sorry for cutting you, but just request if you could please summarize in the interest of time so that we can progress. Yeah, we also understand that the AGN chair is on the call already and would like to give some remarks. So kindly, sorry for the interruption.
I'm done. I'm almost done. So yeah, transparency is important, and I think with regards to transparency, we are also calling for a decision around adoption of a commonly agreed definition of climate finance to help us to identify what actually counts as climate finance under the new goal. I think lastly, we're also looking at sort of clear development of a burden sharing agreement or framework among the developing countries, of course, based on their global share of responsibility and financial capabilities, considering the principles of CBDRC. And this is very crucial for us because this actually is already provided within the convention in Article 4.3. And therefore, the outcome of the NCQG need to acknowledge the importance of the burden sharing agreement, as opposed to the current destructive discussions we are hearing around expanding the contributor base. So in conclusion, I think for Africa, access to sustainable and quality finance remains a key priority for us to achieve the interrelated objectives of sustainable development, as well as economic growth, including poverty reduction, as well as addressing climate change. And therefore, we need a COP that actually delivers a balanced outcome on sustained and enhanced climate action. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Splendid. Thank you very much, Saada, for that very, very informative presentation. And I think also quite a well-detailed paper that presents the key issues that are of priority to the continent of Africa. So we will be delving into this more discussion and maybe in the question and answer section. But at this point, I'd like to just give the floor to the AGN chair, His Excellency Ambassador Ali. Ambassador Ali also happens to be the climate envoy for Kenya. And now he's chairing the Africa Group of Negotiators. So he'll be leading the African team of negotiators in Baku in demanding for the key priorities for the continent. So, Mr. Ali, welcome very much. This is a forum where we are presenting the key demands for the African continent, but specifically just let you know that these are voices from different CSOs across the African continent. So a collection of CSOs have shared their views on what they would be demanding from the COP in Baku, and as such, we are launching these papers today that are covering finance. So that the one that Sada just presented, then we have one on adaptation, and also have one on energy. Because we believe as African CSOs that these three key issues remain to be very fundamental for the African continent to achieve the development it needs. So at this juncture, I'd like to give the floor to you to maybe present your remarks on where you see us going and where in terms of the COP and what kind of demands maybe we can be able to carry up in COP, and also how as African CSOs, you can be able to step in and support your work as you lead the continent in demanding for what it rightfully deserves. Welcome, Your Excellency.
Good afternoon from Baku, where I am currently with the lead coordinators and lead negotiators from the continent preparing for the upcoming COP29. And let me thank you all for your time and for inviting us to join with you. We very much value the contribution of African CSOs. You've always been forefront in providing strong voices to the critical issues of the African continent. As you all know, in just a few days now, today is Tuesday, is another 3 days or so. By Monday next week, we'll be starting the COP here in Baku. We look forward to meeting many of you in person if you're coming, and working together to push the African agenda, as it were, in this important COP. I listened to the presentation Saada was making, very elaborate and right to the point, in line with what African ministers agreed to in Abidjan a few months back. That was early September. And I think that is really the position. We don't have any variant position as lead negotiators here than what was given by our ministers and subsequently endorsed by the heads of state and government. As you probably all know, the COP is taking place within the broader global geopolitical framework that is currently taking shape. Tomorrow, or is it today actually, on the biggest economy in the world is going for elections, and the outcome of that elections will, to some extent, maybe to even a very large extent, have implications for the final outcome of the climate discussions here in Baku. At the same time, of course, there are serious conflicts that are taking place. There are serious challenges to the whole issue of multilateralism that is really in question, let alone matters of climate change, whether really multilateralism itself is able to survive in light of, excuse me, what is happening currently globally, and the whole movement to far right by a number of developed country parties. So all these have implications for the critical issues that have been negotiated here, which is essentially finance. So in order for us to achieve a real outcome, we have also to be realistic and understand what is happening around us and how do we position ourselves in light of all these development. And as you definitely all know and just presented, issues of the new goal on finance is one of the main expectations from this conference. And finance is such a sensitive issue anywhere, whether it is in developing part of the world or developed part of the world. And the questions now is not just how much, which is the quantum, but from where and who. So the whole issue of contributor base, the whole issue of the recipient are now becoming contentious issues suddenly, despite the clarity that the Convention and the Paris Agreement provide. Then of course, the other issue is the whole issue of transition, which we agreed under the GST and the global stocktake in Dubai. And as the world transitions from intense or high carbon developments to low carbon and resilient development, technologies are not equally shared. How should those technologies be shared? How should those technologies be accessed, and so forth? And who should pay for the desired technologies? Again, you will all be aware the reports that were recently released by the United Nations Environment Program, for example, on the emission gap report, and the warnings that they have given, and the reality that despite all the decisions taken many years, several years, every other year, in fact, at COPs, the emissions are still increasing. And the World Meteorological Organization also just released a report to show the concentration of carbon dioxide in the global atmosphere. And the reports from this organization, that organization, on the impacts of climate change all over, whether it is in the global north or the global south, the financial implications, the livelihood implications, and the hundreds of thousands of lives being lost and so forth. So all this is happening and all this is known, but to what extent are we really committed? Do we have the political will as global community to respond to this? And for us, a continent of 1.4 billion people, really, that's only emitting 4%, just 4%. Even if we take 101% ambition to reduce our emissions, still the critical thing for us is to develop the resilience and adaptation for the situation that we find ourselves. So adaptation is a top priority for the African continent. And we will encourage you as civil society organizations to push the importance of adaptation for us and adaptation is everything for us. Even energy that you are discussing currently, energy is adaptation for Africa. Without energy, we cannot develop. Without energy, we cannot have resilience. And without energy, we cannot have education or health and all those important things. So energy is adaptation for us. Health is adaptation for us. Education is adaptation for us. Infrastructural development is adaptation for us. And growth and development really is the key thing for our continent. One particular thing that I will wish to underscore that I will need your support as civil society organizations is the unfairness that often is pushed down our throats as Global South, but more so as Africa. And this relates to the decision of hosting institutions. As you're aware, the very important institution that's going to deal with matters, technical matters of loss and damage, that the UN agency is hosting that secretariat, this is the Santiago Network, recommended Nairobi in Kenya as the most cost-effective institution, place or city to host the Santiago Network Secretariat. Yet, because our colleagues in Geneva, when the board was meeting there, offered $2 million in kind to host the secretariat, in the wisdom of that board, they decided to go against the recommendations of the the UN agencies who were mandated by the COP to go and carry out an analysis and recommended Geneva, one of the most expensive theses in the world, to host a secretariat that's supposed to provide technical support on a matter to vulnerable countries, on loss and damage to vulnerable countries. And that is an issue that is unfair, unjustified, and unethical, really. If it was developing countries or particular African countries doing that kind of thing, it will be all over the place as headline news. But because it was done by a developed country, it's all well and good. So we'll be challenging that, and we will really want you to take up this issue and to, give it prominence in your meetings, in your submissions, in your whatever newsletters and communications, in your social media, so that when we challenge that, you also help us in promoting it and arguing for it as well. So wishing you well, colleagues, looking forward to seeing you. We are here as lead coordinators, and I have to go back and continue the meeting of the lead coordinators to conclude a few agenda items. And I'll be ready to engage with you once you are all here in Baku. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ali, for those very insightful remarks coming from your side, and we've taken note of the things you've said, and we'll try as much as possible to ensure that we also remain to be your foot soldiers, even as you continue negotiating the negotiations rooms. As African CSOs, will help amplify the messages you shared with us. And thank you very much again for creating time to speak to us, and of course, sharing the vision you have for the peoples of Africa as you go to the COP. Asante sana. So, colleagues, as you've heard from the African group of negotiators chair, I think there are a number of issues that he's spoken about that are quite fundamental. One is remaining realistic, especially in understanding the geopolitics in which we're operating in. And then, of course, also underpinning the fact that finance remains to be a critical issue. And of course, when speaking about finance, also just underscoring the fact of knowing where the finance is coming from and who is supposed to contribute it. Of course, we know now the politics of the contributor basis politics that's coming up at the COP. So just understanding these nuances. And then, of course, he's also spoken about the question of transition. And of course, here he spoke about technology. So speaking specifically on how is, for example, Africa going to get this technology and who is supposed to finance it. Just note that the World International Intellectual Property Organization notes that close to 80% of the technology required to ensure that we adapt or maybe achieve the targets of set up by the IPCC by 2030 is already there. The question has always been on the access. So how does, for example, the continent of Africa be able to access this? He has also spoken about the question of political will from the global community. That is the global community really willing to further this discussion and ensure that the world is able to achieve its goals of living within a temperature that can be able to live in well. I think it's also important to reiterate the fact that even as we push for adaptation and all that we're not saying that we don't want mitigation, because again, we cannot adapt in a world, for example, of 3-point-something degrees Celsius. We must ensure that we remain within the confines of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius as proposed by the IPCC. So this remains very critical. I think what also is said that's quite important is the question of adaptation and what adaptation is really for the people of Africa. That adaptation is not just a subject of discussion, but it is the lifeline of the people. And he has mentioned that adaptation is the education, is energy, health, and all facets of the economy that you can think about is what really make up adaptation. So adaptation, I think from what you're saying, equals development for the peoples of Africa. And that's why I think it remains to be very, very critical. And last but not least, what he factored in was the question of the unfairness often pushed down the throats of African countries and other global South countries. And of course, calling on us to be able to amplify this issue in our meetings and ensure that it is well taken care of, especially when it comes to this COP. So of course, sharing just there the example of the Santiago network being taken over by Switzerland just because they agreed to give $2 billion in kind to the board. Then the board, from that incentive, making the decision to host like the health secretariat in Geneva. And as we all know, Geneva is very expensive, very much detached from the realities of the global south, and is also for Africa, because as in Switzerland is quite a very, very developed country. So probably when you are far away from the needs of the people, you might not be able to understand what will they need. So I hope that you can all take up this call even as we progress. So thank you all for paying attention to him, and I hope that we've all taken note of that. Now to progress to the next levels of our presentation, and thanks again, Sada, for what you gave for the finance presentation. We will be coming to that, of course, discussing, and again, all the people on the call, please be prepared with the good questions that you have, comments. We'll have a moment for that. We'll be discussing that. For now, I'd want to pass it over to Ndivile Mokoena from Gender CC in South Africa, and Patience Ajikum from Strategic Youth Network, SYND in Ghana, who are going to be speaking about the subject of climate adaptation and why it remains to be a key subject for Africa and what will be the key demands from a CSO perspective. Over to you, Ndivile and Patience.
Thank you, Juma. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, Patience, we can hear you loud and clear.
Great. Thank you once again. I think most of the key issues have already been highlighted by the AGN chair, particularly when he highlighted that for us as Africans, adaptation is everything to us. And so these are key demands from African civil society organizations, particularly on adaptation, going forward to COP29 on adaptation and loss and damage. So the logos you are seeing on the screen are basically some civil society organizations that have assented to these demands as critical adaptation demands for Africa going to COP29. And then briefly, I'll also take you through what were the steps, in developing this, demand, because Juma highlighted earlier that these are demands from broad network of civil society organizations across Africa going to COP29. So Amy, if you can show the next slide. Yes, so the Pan-African Coalition for Adaptation and Resilience, somewhere around May this year, held their convening to brainstorm based on the outcomes of COP28 last year, to brainstorm what are the key demands, for this year's COP29, particularly when it comes to adaptation. And so at the workshop, there were some key ideas that came up, and that was when we started developing the position paper, highlighting the key demands for Africans on adaptation going to COP29. And these decisions or these demands were highlighted further at the Bonn climate negotiations, where some of the members were there to also push for these demands to be highlighted at Bonn in June. And then also after the key outcomes from the Bonn negotiations, we also make sure that we align our key demands to well suit the global conversation around adaptation and loss and damage and resilience. And then we took it further, after Bonn, like I mentioned, that it was important for us to realign our key demands to suit the current trends globally. And so we called for additional inputs from August to September. We had various meetings to refine the position paper, and that is what we are going to be presenting to you as key demands from African civil society organization on adaptation, loss, and damage. So this is a brief overview of the position paper, and then this has been highlighted countless times that adaptation is a critical priority for us as Africans, as a continent that contributes very little to global greenhouse emissions, yet our socioeconomic and underlying conditions do not help us to really adjust and adapt very well to the increase of the climate crisis. But you also see that globally, there has been a lot of attention on mitigation over the years, particularly when it comes to the UNFCCC negotiations and the annual meetings. And so for us, going to COP29 as civil society organization, we are really demanding that there's a need for us to push strongly for adaptation, if not to be given even more higher attention than mitigation, but for it to be at parity, when it comes to the global climate change conversation, to see a lot of attention being moved to adaptation. And then also at COP29, we are demanding for developed countries to deliver on their already promises on climate finance, which is the 100 billion finance goal, and then also the doubling of the adaptation finance pledge by 2025. And then also we also demanding for more finance to be, or more support to be given to African countries to be able to adapt adequately to the increasing impacts of the climate crisis. Our third demand is to accelerate the operationalization of the UAE framework for global climate resilience and the UAE Berlin work program. All the 11 targets that have been set under the global goal and adaptation, for it to be successfully achieved, it will depend on securing outcome-based indicators and robust means of implementation. And so for us going to COP29, we are demanding for means of implementation indicators to be included.
Patience, I think we dropped you. If you can hear me. Patience.
Hi, sorry, Juma, can you hear me?
We can hear you now.
Yes, yes. My apologies for that. So like I mentioned, for the indicators, we are demanding as civil society organizations, and this is quite a contentious issue as to whether or not there should be indicators for the means of implementation. But I think Juma also mentioned earlier, no matter the goals and the targets that have been set, we will not be able to actualize it if we do not have the needed finance and technical and then technological capacity to be able to implement them. So we are also calling for means of implementation indicators to also be set under the UAE framework for global climate resilience and also the UAE Berlin work program. And also on national adaptation plans, we all know the importance of national adaptation plans for African countries in building the resilience of our countries, our respective countries. And so at COP29, we are demanding for that for most of the African countries that have already not submitted their national adaptation plans, we are calling for support, both financial and technical support, for them to be able to develop their national adaptation plans. And for those who have already developed their adaptation plans, to also give them the necessary support to help them to be able to implement these adaptation plans to build the resilience of their people and the communities in the countries. And also our fifth demand is on transforming the food and agricultural systems to be able to build resilience. For us at COP29, we are demanding for agroecology to be seen as a key adaptation tool to achieving resilient food systems. And then we are also demanding for more finance to be tailored to meeting the demands and the needs of our smallholder farmers, small-scale farmers, and also the indigenous and vulnerable people in our communities. And the last one on the bolster the fund for responding to loss and damage. And I think for us, the key demand has already been highlighted by the AGN chair, which is for COP29 to reconsider the decision to host the Santiago Network in Geneva and rather host it in Nairobi. And then we are also asking to fast track the operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund, because the Loss and Damage Fund being launched at COP28 was one of the main outcomes and one of the key things that African civil society organizations were very happy about. But like the agent said, we don't have to sit quietly and ask and see such decisions like hosting of the Santiago Network being hosted at Geneva instead of Nairobi. We need to be able to strongly push against this at COP29. So this is also one of our key demands under the Loss and Damage Fund going to COP29. Next slide, Amy. Thank you, Amy. I mean, this slide is just to give a little more background information as to why adaptation is such a critical priority for us as Africa. And then as we all experience in our respective countries, we continue to bear the brunt of the climate crisis. There are increasing dry spells, particularly around the food baskets of our countries. There's increasing rate of flooding. There are extreme weather events that we experience in Africa. Yet there seems there's a huge gap when it comes to adaptation finance to help our countries to be able to really adapt to the impacts of the climate crisis. Our region, we face different and significant adaptation implementation finance gaps. Despite our level of vulnerability, there's still very lagging commitments when it comes to climate finance. And so these are the reasons why adaptation remains a very critical priority for us. Going to COP29 and civil society organization, we believe that there's a need for us to continue to push for and to highlight these demands at COP29. Next slide, Amy. I mean, there has already been a very good presentation on the demands when it comes to finance. But again, our countries will not be able to adapt adequately to the impact of the climate crisis without adequate finance and also the technological support. And so that is why, as African Civil Society Organization, we are calling for an increase in high quality adaptation finance from developed countries to climate vulnerable countries. And this continues to remain a top priority for us. And particularly under the new finance goal, the NCQG, we are calling for a sub-goal for adaptation based on developing countries' priority needs. And then as part of this goal, priority should be given to all. We should consider it being grant-based instead of concessional loans, debt, and other forms of financing. And also, we are also calling for a sub-goal in addition to having a sub-goal for adaptation under the NCQG, to also establish loss and damage as a third pillar alongside adaptation and mitigation in the new finance goal. And there also has to be a clear definition of what climate finance is and what climate finance is not. And because over the years, we've seen a lot of reports from Oxfam and other organizations that is indicating even the quality of finance or the quality of finance that we are receiving in developing countries. So because this new finance goal is really going to a large extent set the state of place for climate finance in the years to come, it's very important that there's a clear definition as to what is climate finance and what climate finance is not in the NCQG. And also, I highlighted earlier that for developed countries, it's very important that we come up with a clear roadmap on how they're going to fulfill the existing climate finance pledge, which is the 100 billion goal, and so how they're also going to meet the doubling of climate finance goal pledge by 2025. And then we are also demanding for the scale up of commitment to meet evolving adaptation needs as identified by the global stock take, the IPCC assessment, and also as countries are in the process of revising their nationally determined contributions. And for the first ever high-level ministerial dialogue that is going to be held on adaptation finance, because this COP is dubbed as a finance COP, we believe that it's a very critical moment for us to be able to push for more political momentum to address the widening adaptation finance gap that we experience. The UNEP, adaptation gap report always indicates how much developing countries need based on the increasing impact of climate crisis, but we also see how much is available and the limited finance that is always provided when it comes to adaptation. And so this high-level ministerial dialogue, being the first time, really provides a very good opportunity for us to push for more political will and momentum to address the widening finance gap. And we also have to push for, I mentioned earlier that it's important that particularly for us as civil society organizations, we push for adaptation to be given equal priority just as mitigation, and even, or if not higher. And so it's also important for us that we advocate for equal climate finance allocation for climate change adaptation, particularly for us as African countries, since adaptation is a lifeline for our continent. And additionally, we are calling for more financial support. I think I've already highlighted the more financial support for Africa when it comes to adaptation because of the huge adaptation needs that we have as a country and the huge climate risks that we face all across the African African continent. And we're also calling for the reform of the global financial architecture. And I think this was also highlighted in the finance presentation, that this is already an conversation. But for us as civil society organization advocating for adaptation, we want to see that in the reform of the global financial architecture, adaptation is placed as a top priority globally. And
yes, Patience, again, you've dropped.
Sorry, Juma, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, so just to quickly wrap up, and then I hand over to Indivele to take you through the other key demands on the loss and damage and other issues. I just also want to highlight that for us as civil society organizations, I would say one of the top priorities for us that we want to continue to push for, and then we are requesting all others to support us in pushing for at COP29, is a sub-goal on adaptation as part of the NC and the NCQG. I mentioned earlier that this new goal on finance is really, to a large extent, going to set the tone or to set the state of play when it comes to climate finance for a long time. And so it's very important that we continue to push for this support on adaptation and based on our developing countries' needs. And also, most importantly, there also has to be indicators in the UAE Belém work program. There also have to be indicators specifically on means of implementation. I think now I'll hand over to Indivele to highlight the rest of the demands.
Yes, thanks, Patience, and over to you, Indivele.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Juma?
Yes, I can.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Patience, for laying the foundation, setting the scene on adaptation. Continuing from where Patience left, when it comes to the UAE framework for global climate resilience and the Belém work program on indicators, this line of work must be fast-tracked and operationalized. This is some of the issues or some of our demands at COP29. So looking at COP29 expectations, to advance the GGA and the UAE Belém work program, COP29 must incorporate the following outcomes. And looking at the retaining of inclusion of equity, I think SADA has highlighted a lot on that, but we need to emphasize that there has to be the retainment of inclusion of equity and common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities principles. These principles must be retained from the born outcome text, recognizing these as integral to achieving the GGA. Also advancing the work related to the framework based on paragraph 38 of the COP28, which is referring to knowledge exchange. So we're calling for the workshop or expert dialogues to ensure knowledge and information exchange, including traditional knowledge, most importantly, for effective implementation of the FGCR. A need to conduct comprehensive assessment of risks, impacts, and adaptation capacity gap and needs in developing countries, providing a foundation for more targeted support for effective implementation of national adaptation plans. I think this will be also very critical when you look at a national level. And there has to be an agreement on the terms of reference for a review mechanism to assess the effectiveness of the FGCR, identifying the scope, frequency, and processes for stakeholder engagement. Equally important is the re-establishment of an agenda item on the GGA. And looking at the UAE Belém work program, here, I think the establishment of a clear link between the GGA and UAE Belém work program and the NCQG on climate finance is quite critical to address the growing adaptation finance gaps, and also as establishing a need for clear and concrete outcome-based indicators for means of implementation for means of implementation across thematic and policy cycle targets. I think Sada and Patience have touched on that. Just emphasizing on those issues and also agreeing on the purpose, set of key principles, categories, and scope, looking at the global and local level to guide development of global adaptation considerations. Also, I think that's the last point that Patience mentioned, to set clear work plan for technical work in 2025 to ensure that a decision is made on adaptation indicators at COP30. Next slide, Amy. The next slide, we're looking at fast-tracking transformative national adaptation plans. To close the gap between adaptation needs and action, COP29 must expedite progress on national adaptation plans by developing decisive position that recognizes Africa's unique vulnerability to climate impacts due to its high dependency on climate-sensitive sectors such as agriculture, water, health, and transport, establishes a link between equity, CBDRRC principles, and climate justice principles and means of implementation support for NEP's development and implementation. We're also calling for developed nations to provide timely and adequate means of financial capacity building and technical support. I think even Mr. Ambassador Ali emphasized on this point here. And the next point, hello, can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, the next point is to urge the UNFCCC financial mechanisms to provide scaled up, expedited, accessible, and direct financial support for developing countries to prepare and execute the NEPs, urging all country parties to update and align their NEPs with the targets identified in the FGCR, the 2023 GST findings, and also the revised NDCs, and calling on all countries that have not submitted their NEPs to do so by 2025, so that we can all contribute to the second GST assessment of the FGCR, which is set to conclude in 2028. And I think on this slide, finally, is to encourage countries to integrate cross-cutting issues and priority sectors into the NEPs, including agriculture and, yes, I think all the main thematic targets that are mentioned in the GGA, and also calling for developed countries and public financial institutions to increase gender responsive and socially inclusive adaptation finance for the NEPs. The next slide, Amy. Here we're looking at agriculture. I think Patience did emphasize on the importance of agriculture for Africa. We need to transform food and agriculture system to build resilience. So COP29 must deliver on agriculture, guided by the progress already made under the Sharm el-Sheikh joint work on agriculture. So COP29 has to deliver a decision that recognizes agriculture as an adaptation and a just transition sector, rather than mitigation priority for Africa and other developing countries. I think we need to emphasize that for us, priority has to be adaptation. And also to emphasize the importance of rights of smallholder farmers, especially female farmers, and mainstreaming indigenous knowledge systems. Recognizing the rights of small-scale and artisanal fisheries, and also expand the scope of the Sharm el-Sheikh joint work, as I have mentioned, that it is important for Africa and to be able to attain food sovereignty and the rights and inclusion of underrepresented groups that are always left behind. And looking also of the climate finance when it comes to loss and damage in agriculture. Updating the roadmap from Bonn with concrete steps at the global and national level, and also recognizing the interlinkages between the joint work plan and climate finance and adaptation, loss and damage, and just transition, with specific emphasis on calling for finance for adaptation, loss and damage, and that it has to be directed towards smallholder farmers. I think that is key when it comes to agriculture. Also shifting finance towards farmer and peasant-led agroecological transition. Yeah, going to my last slide, which is on bolstering fund for loss and damage. I think the estimates for loss and damage when it comes to Africa indicates that it ranges between 289.2 to $444.5 billion from the period between 2022 estimated up to 2030. So that is a lot of fund that is required to address loss and damage in Africa. So COP29 must agree to deliver concrete decision on the structure, governance, and financing of the fund, advocate for direct access window to the fund for loss and damage, and also urges developed nations to turn COP28 pledges. I think Sada and Patience already touched on that the COP pledges of $790 million into contributions and come up with new pledges for COP29. These pledges have to be, we have to see results. They have to come to fruition. Recognizing loss and damage as a third pillar alongside adaptation and mitigation. That point has to be emphasized. And also to ensure that loss and damage sub-goal is included in the NCQG. Increase new grant-based commitments must be pledged to the fund from wealthy nations, calling for the operationalization of the Santiago network on loss and damage, and also to reconsider the Santiago network on loss and damage board's decision to host the network in Geneva. Yeah, just to emphasize that point, which was touched by the ambassador and also Patience. Yeah, thank you so much. This is my last slide. Thanks, Amal. Thank you, Juma. Over to you.
All right, excellent, Ndivile and Patience for the very insightful presentations. And very good points you are raising there pertaining adaptation for the African continent, and of course also looking at the very important sector of agriculture that stands with us. And also, of course, looking at the question of loss and damage. I would just like to speak to our very patient audience that you are maybe speaking with, and two, that please hold your horses. We'll have some time when you'll be able to share your sentiments and comments about the topics we're discussing here. Also, just note that this conversation will continue off this call, as in that is online on our socials in this call. So please feel free to continue engaging with us even after the call ends today. Now we'd want to shift further and go to Mr. Emmanuel Umpula, who will be speaking to us about the next subject, that is energy and a green industrialization on the African continent. Mr. Emmanuel, you are much welcome. Please feel free to introduce yourself, maybe the organization you work for, and then you can take it over from there. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much, and sorry for the noise you will hear because I'm traveling. I'm not in the town, and the place where I am now, there is not electricity, and my laptop's low bat, so I just asked for colleagues to start for me the generator, so I can talk to you now. Yeah. So talking about energy and especially about energy transition, I think we all know that global South and especially Africa are on what we can call strategic minerals or critical minerals, depend on the angle you are seeing them. But for AfriWatch and our coalition, which is African Coalition on Green Minerals, we call them strategic minerals. So in my presentation, because I didn't really make a presentation because I didn't have enough time to prepare, but I'll just give you a bit of context, what we've seen in this area. We see that the demand of those critical minerals or strategic minerals is day by day increased because we need those minerals to have a clean energy. So we need to move from the energy which is not good to a clean energy. We need to stop using fuel and move to a clean energy. And for that transition, we need those minerals. And that's why the reason day by day, the production, the demand is just getting up and up. At the same time, if you look in Africa, global South in general, in Africa, you will see that the production of those minerals is becoming higher and higher. An example, for cobalt, for instance, now DRC only is producing more than 200,000 tons of cobalt. And in terms of copper, DRC only has reached 3 million tons of copper a year. But if you put other African countries like Zambia and other countries, I mean, we have reached as a continent a big amount of production. And another example for DRC, for instance, from 2007 to 2023, we have produced more than 15 million tons, no, 14 tons of a million of copper. That means even during the colonization period, they didn't produce that amount of production. But at the same time, Africa is still poor. DRC still poor. So as a coalition working on this green energy transition, the question is why? Why we are producing those minerals? Why we are doing to secure the world? At the same time, we are still poor. Our communities are poor. Our government doesn't have enough money. And I understand when you are talking about copper, you are talking about COP29. Most of the subject is that rich countries should pay for the pollution. They need to pay. You are talking about 100 billions wealthy countries should pay to us. But at the same time, we saw that they are taking a lot of minerals, which worth a lot of billions out of Africa. And we're still waiting for them to pay to us. So it's I think it's a problem. That's why we are thinking about how can African countries try to build an ecosystem where we can produce those minerals, not just for them to go as they are going now as raw materials, because even why we are not getting enough money from those minerals, because they are just, we export them as raw materials. So we have some recommendation I can share with you. If we need to change the paradigm, what we should do. The first recommendation is that we need to promote the development of critical energy, transition minerals, manufacturing value chains, where concentrated efforts are made to ensure that local owned value chains in Africa are developed, to better stress the manufacturing of high quality finished goods required to decarbonize economies and renewable energy system. That's one. Two, we must advocate for planet people focused on industrial policies linked to the just transition work program. These policies should promote green industrialization in development countries through critical minerals. And the third one, in terms of the outcome at COP29, must recognize, prioritize, and support this centrality of artisanal mining, small-scale miners in Africa. So that's some recommendation. But what we are to summarize, what we are asking is that we need to not just to export those minerals as raw materials, but we need to make sure that we are creating value at the local in the continent before we export those minerals. And there is a report which was published by SOMO, which is a Netherlands organization last May, which was showing that if we still exporting those minerals, raw minerals, Africa is losing billions and billions in terms of money. So instead of begging money at the COP29, we need to think about how we can make this money here in Africa, because we have those key minerals, which everyone is aiming to have the energy transition. So for this energy transition to be fair and just for everyone, then we need to make sure that Africa owns its own minerals and has a clear program. We have African mining vision, which is very good. Why not we are not implementing it? Why not we are not working together as African countries to create the value chain at a continental level? Yes, that are some thoughts about the energy transition and the work we are doing and the demand we are asking for COP29. Thank you so much.
Excellent, excellent, Mr. Emmanuel. Thank you very much for those very good points. I think you raised some very, very fundamental points that, if taken into consideration, I think it will be able to help the continent transform to the better as we want. I think you've noticed some very important points, such as the demand for critical minerals on the continent is growing at a very fast rate. But at the same time, even as the minerals are leaving the continent, they are leaving the continent in its raw state. And of course, this means that the African continent is earning less than what's supposed to earn if we can be able to add some more value chain. And of course, calling upon African people and governments maybe to add some more value and maybe to ask that value addition to be done within the confines or the geographical confines of the African continent, so that more benefits can be accrued here on the continent. And then, of course, you also mentioned the need to move towards a cleaner energy and leave the dirty fuels that have been having detrimental effects to the peoples using them. And of course, in this case, mostly if you look at our kitchens at home, is normally our mothers and our sisters who are always more impacted because of this. And then, of course, just underscoring the fact that Africa has strategic minerals, but at the same time, the strategic minerals are not working for the continent. So how do we convert these minerals to work for the benefits of the peoples of Africa? Again, to all our presenters, thank you very much for the very good presentations and very, very insightful points. I think they have taken us a notch high in terms of understanding the kind of environment that we operate in as a continent. At this juncture, I'd want to open it up to all our very patient audience that has been waiting to maybe ask some questions or have some inputs. Please feel free to raise your hand or maybe type your question into the chat box if you're not able to speak, and we'll be able to come to you. I can see already you have one, William Worley. You're welcome, sir. William, over to you. Just requesting if our comms team can help maybe make William to be able to speak from his mic. Formula, please. In the meantime, even as that is happening, William, you can now unmute yourself and speak.
Can I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Hi, thank you very much to everybody for the great presentations. My name is Will Worley. I am a journalist with the New Humanitarian. We're a non-profit news outlet focused on global crises. I will be traveling to Baku next week, and I'm interested in a lot of the issues that have been raised here today. My question is about climate policy, climate finance, and fragile and conflict affected states. Now, this there's quite a bit of policy buzz around getting more climate finance to places affected by fragility or conflict, some in Africa, some not in Africa. But I haven't heard so much talk about that today. And I know I missed some of the session, but I'm just wondering, is that a concern of some of the panelists, or is this maybe a policy agenda driven by others in the global north? How do people feel about the thematic agenda, not the UNFCCC agenda, of getting more climate finance into fragile and conflict affected states? Thank you.
All right, thanks, Willie. And I think, yes, our able panelists would be able to respond to you. I don't know if there's any other questions so that we can maybe have some rounds of questions, then we can come back again to pick others. Any other question or comment from the audience? So I do not see any hands up as at now. Okay, we have Vivian Chime. Please, at the comms team, if you could make Vivian Chime a speaker. Yes, Vivian, now you can mute yourself.
Okay, hi, Juma. Thank you very much. Well, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I really want to appreciate all of the speakers who have spoken so well. I wanted to really get clarity on the 1.3 trillion that Africa is asking for, right? So I want to know, is this 1 trillion just or for all developing countries, and have all other developing countries agreed for this 1.3 trillion as a demand that they are going to COP29 with? And also about the $400 billion, I think one of the speakers mentioned that for adaptation. Is this also built into the NCQG, or is this a separate demand? I'd really want to get clarity on the different finance mechanisms and what we are looking at going into COP29. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Vivian. Of course, our able presenters will be able to respond to that question. Anyone else that has any questions before we go to the people who are presenting, maybe to provide some responses? None. Okay. So we have two questions with us, one from William and one from Vivian Chime. And of course, they're all speaking, I think, the question of finance. So I don't know if we can begin with you, Sada. Do you have any perspectives on the questions that have been asked? But again, also just to request some of the team members, if you have any responses to some of the questions that have been asked, we should not just leave this burden to the speakers alone. So you're much welcome also to respond after Sada goes. Over to you, Sada.
Thank you, Juma, and also William, for the questions. So I'll respond to the second question. In terms of, just to understand, the NCQG is a mobilization goal. So there's a general consensus around for developing countries to actually ask for 1 trillion at least. If you look at the Arab group, if you look at the LDC group, if you look at the ILAC and the SEEDS, everyone is basically having that consensus around asking for 1 trillion. And this is actually based on the different need assessment reports that have been done that showed that actually the needs range between 5 to around 6 trillion between now and 2030. So that gives you an annual figure of 1 trillion. So it's an overall goal for all developing countries. But of course, different bit of variations in terms of, is it just 1 trillion or 1 point something trillion? But yes, the figure is at least 1 trillion. But for Africa, based on our own assessment and also different reports that we are referring to, for us, we believe that the demand is between 1 and 1.3 trillion. So that is an overall figure as a mobilization goal. And yes, within that goal, we're also calling for a thematic goal, for 400 billion USD per thematic area, that is for adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage. And that is something that developing countries are generally pushing. We are not getting sort of good direction, good sort of intention from the other side, but that's what we are pushing to ensure that we have that balanced allocation within the mobilization goal. But remember, the target for adaptation is also based on the reports that have been released, including the UNEP report that have estimated around 4 billion, which is also, we need to recognize that it's also an understatement, and we cannot really fully acknowledge, assess the needs of adaptation based on the limited methodologies. So as a basis or as a flow, that's what countries are using at the moment. And if you look at even the needs assessment report by UNFCCC, they have also sort of, their estimations range around that, for trillions for annual, at least trillions for overall goal, and also the 400 billion for adaptation. So I hope that answers your question. So now to William, I will talk about during the 2-year deliberation that we've had on the new collective quantified goal. Of course, all these deliberations have to be done within the context of the Paris Agreement and the Convention, even though we've seen new sort of introduction or new asks from developing country parties on different issues that are not necessarily provided for. So what I can say to that is there has been issues around enhancing access to certain regions or blocks within the UNFCCC that's already recognized in the Paris Agreement. For instance, the agreement recognizes the special circumstances for Africa, for instance, the LDCs and also the SEEDS. So there have been call generally to have enhanced access to these regions. But I remember during the deliberations, there have been views from mostly the developed countries who are trying now to I would say there was a general push by developing countries to sort of change even the beneficiaries of these finances from the general developing countries to sort of put some specialized groups or subgroups. So there have been some mention of countries in fragile and conflict state, yes, but there was also strong opposition from the rest of the parties, mostly from developing countries, is that we might not need to sort of fragment these regions further, because you'll find some of these countries that are affected by conflicts, they can somehow broadly fall either under LDCs or under Africa or under SAIDs. So sort of going into now that nitty-gritties might actually bring issues. So as at now, I think we don't have that in the draft text, but I believe it might come up at some point. But I will understand at the moment, it's not necessarily provided for in the Paris Agreement as well as in the convention, from my own understanding. But I think that is what I can say to that question. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Sada. I can see some questions are also coming up in the chat. And also just to let us all know that for all the position papers that have been spoken to today, we already have them on the PowerShift website, in which our comms team will be sharing the link where you can be able to access these papers and maybe get more details on them. So apart from that, there I can see the question like, are these monies loans or goodwill funds? Maybe again, it's a finance question, probably Saada, but also if there's another person maybe on the call, one of the panelists that maybe understands these conversations, happy to, please feel free to just jump in and share your views on what you think about this question. And then also, Michael Ombewa is asking what progress has been made towards remittance of loss and damage fund to Global South countries. In case, again, somebody understands this topic very well and want to jump in, please feel free to do so.
So maybe I can come in on the question,
Yes.
are these monies loans or goodwill funds? So I think in terms of the mandate to provide these finances, it's rests on the developed countries, and this money has to move from developed to developing countries, and this is actually based on the historical responsibilities and their financial capabilities to support the climate action in developing countries, and this is clearly provided for in the convention as well as the Paris Agreement. So that is generally in terms of responsibilities and mandates. But when it comes to actual funds, ideally within this convention and also the Paris Agreement, it doesn't talk about issues of loans. It talks about predictable finances in form of grants from various sources. It's just that we've seen under the previous the current climate finance regime, most of this climate finance was being delivered in form of loans, but ideally within the principles of this convention and the frameworks of the UNFCCC, it has to be in form of grants or grant equivalent terms. So it's not, that's why under this new goal, we are actually calling for quality finance, not just finance, but quality finance. Thank you. And maybe I can also jump on the question on loss and damage, and other guys can also chip in. At the moment, what we have as of COP28, because the fund operation led at COP28, at the moment we have the pledges that are around around 700 million USD. So just pledges. They have not been actualized into contributions from different countries. But I think as of last month, the board of this fund actually reported on getting around 10 million in terms of actual financial commitments from these pledges, which is again very little. So this COP is now going to fast track the governance structure of the fund, and also to ensure that this fund is actually start getting disbursed to countries for projects. So at the moment, we've not reached that stage of disbursement, but this COP should actually gain traction around that. So thank you.
All right. Yes. Thanks, Sada. The other question that I'm seeing coming from Peter Allen in the chat box is, I noticed that you're using the word adaptation a lot, but it is not a word I have had used so much elsewhere from other climate-related organizations. Can I clarify what you feel comes under the heading adaptation, please? Is it achieving the transition to clean energy? Is it responding to the impacts of climate change, like flooding, etc.? I understand what is meant by this. I think it's useful for everyone to understand what is meant by these various times? Thank you. And of course, coming from Peter. If I may just try to respond to this question very fast, is first of all, adaptation in this case refers to the ability of the African people to respond to the impacts of climate change or to withstand the impacts of climate change. So just to give you an example, if roads are being swept away by frequent floods, how can you be able to come up with an infrastructure system that is not able to be swept away by floods? So like being resilient to the impacts of climate change. And in the event that this happens, how easy are the people of Africa able to bounce back to their normal state even after the calamity happens? So in essence, this is what we mean by climate adaptation. And when we say, for example, that clean air, transition to clean energy is also translates to adaptation, what it means is that it can be a means to helping enhance adaptation, the people to adapt or to withstand impacts of climate change. What do I mean by this? So, for example, if you have lots of harvests that you're having from your farms, and then after some time, maybe they'll get spoiled because of maybe weevils or maybe like other attacks from diseases, you can use clean energy to be able maybe to dry and maybe conserve it for longer periods. And with this, you'll be able to withstand maybe hunger challenges when you have drought seasons, because your food is well taken care of and can stay for longer periods and also see you through challenging moments like droughts. So I see you appreciating. Hope that has helped. Is there any other question or comment? Nope. So I'm not seeing any hands raised up or comments in the chat box. If there are no comments, I'll just want to thank each and every one of you very much. First of all, for having spared time, of course, to spend with us this afternoon and discuss these very critical matters that represent the interests of the peoples of Africa. So all of us, I hope that for those that will be going to Baku and those that will be joining the Conference of Parties virtually, that will be able to amplify these voices of the African people and ensure that they are heard in each and every room that you'll be in. We call upon you to please read the papers that have been shared. The link has already been shared in the chat, but also I know you can find the link on our socials. Please follow us, and also if possible, please record some videos of you speaking about some of the key thematic areas we've spoken about in this papers launch, and then please tag us in your videos on your socials so that you can also retweet and maybe share more and more so that your messages can be advanced further and further. Otherwise, thank you very much. And as you go to COP, again, we call upon each and every one of us to have the sense of unity of purpose and, of course, to speak as a collective and to drive the main agenda that will help save the peoples of Africa from the scourge of climate change. Otherwise, thank you very much, and hoping to meet you in Baku and after Baku to continue this discussion. Just to let us know again, the conversation continues offline on our socials. Please feel free to engage with us. Tweet, retweet about the key messages from this call, and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you very much and have a pleasant time wherever you are.